Hi, welcome to News and Capitalism. This is Josh. In this episode, we speak with Iker Suarez, who authored a searing piece in a monthly review titled The Migrant Genocide, toward a third world analysis of European class struggle. In it, he challenges the dominant humanitarian framing of migrant deaths at sea, arguing that it isn't a moral crisis but a structural necessity of late imperialism. What unfolds on Europe's shores, he contends, is not an aberration but a violent expression of global capital's unraveling. Further, we explore how unresolved agrarian contradictions in the global south, the accumulation of waste, and the labor-capital contradiction are converging in the form of systemic genocide of migrants. We unpack why immigration is not a peripheral issue, but the return of capital's deepest contradictions to the imperial core, and how this rupture shapes Europe's ideological terrain, from the failures of social democracy to the rise of fascism. Iker Suarez is an author, doctoral researcher. He studies neocolonialism in Europe and organizes in socialist, anti-racist, and anti-imperialist movements in Madrid and New York. His work revolves around Europe's borders, class struggle, and immigration politics from the political economy perspective grounded in the third world. He co-authored a book on Spain's southern border enclave in northern Morocco, focusing on neocolonial dynamics that undergird European social democracies. His research focuses on linking European state racism with a holistic understanding of imperialism to better think through strategy. If you like what we do and you want to support our ability to have more conversations like this, please consider becoming a patron. You can do so for as little as $1 a month. You bring these conversations totally independently with no corporate, state, or grant funding. Now, here's Iker discussing some of his work. Okay, so I'm here today with Iker Suarez, and we're discussing first your recent article with the monthly review titled The Migrant Genocide, toward a third world analysis of European class struggle. And in that article, you lay out how many people and institutions in Europe have labeled the mass deaths at its southern borders as a human rights crisis, while nonprofits point to a scandalous contradiction between so-called European values and the brutal reality. But you argue that this isn't a crisis in the way liberal progressive circles have framed it, not because it unsettles Northern consciousness, but because it's a structural necessity of late imperialism and a symptom of a global capital's deeper unraveling. So can you talk us through that argument? What does it mean to reframe this not as a moral rupture, but as a systemic imperative?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, thanks for having me, Josh. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Yeah, so I think this is a good way to start because it kind of, puts us in how this issue is framed. And just to give your listeners a bit of a context about this, in case they're not like really up to speed with what is going on. A bunch of people from the global south are, migrating to Europe to make a better life. And essentially, they come from places all across Africa, West Asia, South Asia as well. And at some point, they take routes that are generally unsafe, be that through the sea or through land to get to the destination, which is Europe, right? And so you have several routes which are very important: Turkey, Greece, from all of the southern Mediterranean to the northern Mediterranean, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco to Italy and Spain, and also a route that is very deadly, which is in the Atlantic, which is from Senegal and Mauritania to the Canary Islands, which is Spanish archipelago of the coast of Mauritania, right? And before getting to the sea, there's the people that do get to these journeys, do very long journeys before that through oftentimes the Sahara Desert, right? Which, according to comrades on the ground, comrades from Niger, Mali, or Morocco, is an even deadlier space than the sea itself. And it's just incredibly difficult to count. So, it's even really hard to quantify, right? But just to give folks a bit of sense of the magnitude of what is going on in the first 5 months of 2025. So from January to May, on their way to Spain, around 12 people died every day. 12 people every day. That's a person every 2 hours that was murdered by European border policy, right? And so this is kind of the crisis that we're facing. 2024 was a particularly deadly year, but this is kind of a constant sort of backdrop of all European politics, right? And so I think with this piece, what I wanted to do is kind of center this as not, a footnote or something that is, an aside to, European social formations, but rather a component that has to be foregrounded, right? As I think we'll get to later on. So organizations on the ground, organizations that I'm part of, kind of respond to this. And to be fair, the response is kind of small within civil society. as, they respond to it as a human rights crisis. These are human rights violations, right? They go against democracy and democratic values, and, the European sort of commitment to equality, humanitarianism, etc., right? All these lofty values that Europe always kind of ascribes to itself, right? And it would seem then that the crisis, is produced by the very moral Europeans who notice this, right? And defy it, rather than perhaps some broader arrangement beyond their position, beyond their consciousness, beyond their sensitivity, right? And so we'll get to this, but I think it's important to first kind of question this framing, right, as both historically inaccurate and a strategic dead end, right? It's historically not inaccurate because, it whitewashes what European democracy is, and in doing so, it re-legitimizes it, right? It coheres, consolidates the strength of that project, of the project of those states, of the European Union, which of course we know is an imperial project, right? And I think something interesting to note here is that, this argument of, this goes against European values, shares, it's adjacent to the fascist discourse of, the European way of life and how this is opposed, to, let's say, Islam, for example, right? So there's a subterranean sort of supremacist tone, if you want, to it that I think has to be challenged. But I think beyond this, the thing is that this human rights crisis framing doesn't explain anything, right? It's just a tragedy, it's just a moral affair, it's just a Europe bad argument, right? And so I think from the position of someone who's organizing in the movement here is I encountered a problem, which is we lack an explanation for this, right? We lack a grammar to formulate what's going on, and thus how to be strategic against it, right? And so I think this is really what the piece kind of was getting at when I wrote it. Is like, we need to understand what's going on to understand exactly how to act against it, right? An explanation that frames it as not exceptional, as not a deviation from the rule, but as part of a totality, right? So I think reframing it not as moral but systemic imperative, I think ultimately means that we go beyond, this is bad policy, or this is, a matter of moral reform, but rather, it's a matter of class struggle, and therefore the title of the piece as well, right? We got to struggle against this through class struggle that is very conscious of the stakes of imperialism in this particular phase, right? And then we can think more strategically. And then I think also it allows us to kind of go beyond this, siloed sort of fight and struggle against particular issues in our societies, right? By framing it as something that is part of the totality of capital, we understand it as one dimension, a very important dimension of the general anti-systemic struggle to overcome the current system that we're in, right? So I think that's kind of important to also marshal a movement and an organizing strategy that is not, self-defeating, or, again, as I said before, something that silos us in our particular issues.
Yes, absolutely. First of all, thank you for breaking that down for us. But kind of shifting gears a little bit, you argue that capitalism's real historical development has produced an agrarian question that remains violently unresolved in the global South, whereas many third world thinkers contend that capital's only solution is mass death. So if you can, talk about this a bit.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that question. This really gets to the core of the argument. So I'm going to try to lay it out. Bear with me. So first of all, I would like to say this is not me arguing it. It's I'm taking up this argument from Samir Amin, of course, who first says this in 2003 in a piece called World Poverty, Pauperization, and Capital Accumulation. And he later elaborates it in a couple other pieces and books. And, I think it's just very useful to understand this particular sort of phenomenon, right? And basically, in broad strokes, the argument is the following about the agrarian question that remains unresolved in the global South, right? Capitalism, when it appears on the scene of history, it arrives and it finds overwhelmingly rural societies, right? So peasant-based, non-productive societies, poor societies, societies that are unable to produce, a surplus, a self-sustaining growth, et cetera, right? Societies that cannot really bring prosperity for the majority, right? And the story goes, according to, the ideologues, is that after capitalist development, you reach, as the global North has reached, modern, wealthy, urban, industrial, and post-industrial societies that essentially, lift the majority above, prior or pre-capitalist levels of prosperity, right? And also, it's societies that have modern agriculture that is productive enough to feed the nation and then even export food, right? Which is what the global North has done for the past many decades. And so, this story of, the capitalist model of development is that, it's good for everyone and it includes the working class by lifting it out of poverty. Once you have this model, this narrative of capitalism, you get development studies, and essentially anyone can follow this capitalist road to develop. Perfect. And so everybody will kind of reach the same element, right? But really, let's look a bit closer, like to understand where this narrative fails. How does this work in the countryside, even in the European context, right? So the arrival of agrarian capitalist relations in Europe, so if you could call it the modernization of the countryside, of, agrarian production, et cetera, begins with the mass expulsion of peasants from their lands, right? It separates them from their means of subsistence, compels them into wage labor, right? So this is the famous primitive accumulation that Marx talks about in Capital Volume 1, et cetera, right? And so what happens with the mass of expelled peasants? They fill the ranks of emerging industrial production, satisfying its demand for labor, and then initiating the urbanization of European society. Essentially, you have the majority of people that are living, peasant, like the lives of peasants, essentially, and then they transition to more urban, wage-based forms of surviving, of organizing their survival and reproducing socially, right? And so what this is kind of the first element that the capitalist story about, modernization and the development model forgets, is that this process actually entails huge violence even for these populations within the European core, right? Insofar as it kind of destroys basically all of their prior forms of, knowing and, just relating to the world materially and ideologically, and then throws them into something completely different. Not to mention, the gendered violence of this moment, if we think about Federici, right? But it also forgets something else. This story also forgets something else, which is, I think, the most crucial, right? Which is that ultimately, all of these people that were expelled from the land and that were thrown into, wage labor or forced into wage labor, many of them, a big chunk of them, were made redundant, right? Capitalist production was not able to reabsorb into employment all the people that it had dispossessed, right? And, what happens with this? We have, the rise of, Europe's dangerous classes, if you will, political turmoil, the risking of, social peace, the potential for, actual insurgency in the core, which is exactly when, the European socialist movement kind of like arises, and Marx starts to write. There's a window there where, social order is not exactly guaranteed in the core as it might seem or might have seemed for a long time after World War II. But anyway, in this sort of predicament, Europe's ruling classes find a solution, right? And the solution is well known. They make room for the surplus populations in their colonies, in the colonial outposts, right? Where genocide literally frees up new means of subsistence, so land, for the excluded white classes, right? And so it's interesting here to think, how, exporting the surplus population, the white surplus population as settlers to the new world and to the colonies fixes the inability of capital to provide for even its own metropolitan subjects. In other words, capitalist development, even in the imperial core, was not able to provide for the totality of its people, and so it had to export them and kill people to actually have them be able to survive, right? Essentially, social contradictions were exported, peace and order were restored, and here the groundwork is laid for that image in the capitalist success story of a modern, industrial, wealthy, and quote-unquote middle-class society, if you will, right? Society where class antagonism has been kind of, banished to the past, if you will. So essentially, this whole transition makes it seem as though Europe had solved its agrarian question, right? The transition to urbanized wage formations appears successful, right? And so this is what, again, capitalist ideologues take up is, you can do this anywhere in the world in any particular national formation, and you can kind of achieve this unprecedented prosperity for the majority, right? But now let's fast forward to the present, okay? And to the third world. And so what Samir Amin tells us is that these conditions just don't hold. And the first of the two conditions is essentially that the industry that absorbed a big part of the expelled peasants and their progeny in Europe, that industry was very labor intensive. It needed so many workers of all types to actually make it function. Whereas today, after 150, 170 years of technological development, of industrial sophistication, etc., the industries that are competitive today in the world market are industries that are highly mechanized, and so they have a lot less capacity to absorb workers like they did in the 19th century and early 20th century Europe, right? And so all the people that might be expelled from their land in the third world today as capitalist penetration into the countryside deepens are actually going to find a lot less jobs. This is the first side of the equation. The second side of the equation, which I was just talking about, is that obviously the third world does not have, colonies to export its surplus populations, and therefore it has an even more compounded problem than the Europeans had back when this was a problematic in their case, right? And so essentially, right, as capitalist relations increasingly penetrate into southern countrysides, right, we can think of global land grabs after deregulation of markets, corporations buying up land all across the south. What happens with all those people that are dispossessed, right? A lot of people are being dispossessed, but you don't have the two fundamental outlets for reabsorbing them and giving them an alternative way of making a living that capitalism of the 19th century, colonial capitalism, had for its surplus populations, right? So where do those people go? How do they reorganize their survival if no employment is offered by those who took their means of survival, right? And so here, Amin tells us, and I quote, "Capitalism, while it solved the question in its centers, did it through generating a gigantic agrarian question in the peripheries, which it can only solve through the genocide of half of humankind," right? And it can only do so because it has no means of providing for them. So it leaves them to die. It kills them, right? That's the solution it has for the Southern agrarian question, right? And so while capitalism was able to some extent to successfully replace how people organize their survival in the North, right, their mode of social reproduction, it actually has no way of doing this in the South. And this is kind of the general dynamic of the capitalist crisis, imperialist crisis at this moment, right? And I think just a couple of notes before I wrap up on this, but I think Amin in this piece is really ahead of his time because he's saying, the prospect for the 3 billion peasants of the present third world, right, if we continue the road of capitalist development, he says, is this the potential seclusion in some kind of reserves, right? Which is a reason why he calls imperialism in its contemporary expression apartheid on a world scale, right? And if we think about how borders work, it kind of actually points to this, right? Because you have people in their countries of origin, right, that are not allowed to leave their own country, but also can't find ways to make a living within them, right? So they live impoverished lives, kind of like in apartheid in the reservations. So this is kind of a very interesting dynamic, right? Essentially, capitalism cannot provide for the social reproduction of the world's majority, right? And if it can make them a living, it will kill them fast or slow, right? One last thing I think it's important to say, and I'm sorry because I'm going on for a long time, but is basically, the agrarian question is really about surplus populations, right? And the argument about surplus populations and immigration is not new, right? I think the problem is that often this concept of surplus populations, it remains undefined, right? And it remains without the specificity of the historical development of capital in the periphery that Samir Amin really gives us, right? And you'll find concepts that are used, the surplus population, et cetera, without real knowledge of, how the southern social formation has developed, what has happened in the countryside, what's the class composition, et cetera. And so it ends up being a shorthand, that stands in for actual knowledge of how imperialism acts in the current moment in the peripheries, right? And I think this is very important because, it's an analytical weakness that ultimately leads to a strategic weakness. And it's something that really we can't overlook because otherwise we just have kind of like muddy understandings, as Max Sile says, of how imperialism really works, right? And so, yeah, I think it's important to kind of concretize the argument of the surplus population in this particular historical development of capital, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate that a lot because I think that, especially in the U.S. context, there seems to be, particularly with regard to like the migrant crisis, happening internationally, speaking, but specifically in the U.S. context, even on the left, there seems to be a very lackluster analysis of it, and even the social antagonisms, particularly the class antagonisms that are happening as a result of it. In that, like, obviously the ruling class designates specific forms of hysteria against specific racialized groups, of course, but there's also an outpouring of antagonism that happens as a result of like jobs and things like that, that makes it paves the way for a deep crisis ultimately, so that that we see play out. And I think people just, it's particularly on the left, seem to dismiss it, if that makes sense, and dismiss like the actual need for an actual progressive migrant policy, if that makes sense, and how immigration functions ultimately. And I think you get at that at the root ultimately. So, but yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's I see this in Europe as well all the time, right? Like it's kind of sidelined, and I think we'll
Yes.
talk about it later. With some of the discussion around Ali Kadri and so on, but it's kind of relegated to a footnote, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like we have class struggle, and then we have this, and this is a huge problem because it basically, you know, I think it ultimately is one of the ways in which we, or the left, or certain types of left, are rendered impotent. And so
Absolutely.
I think it's crucial to address that. Yeah.
Yeah. There definitely is like a specificity when it comes to it as well. But yeah. Um,
Mhm.
so, how does the migrant genocide on Europe's shores reflect this broader tendency, though? And what shifts when we move away from this Eurocentric frame of immigration and class struggle to center the social formation of the third world?
Cool. Yes. So we've painted this picture, of global capitalism, the agrarian question, and how, imperialism has no solution to the Southern agrarian question. And because it cannot provide for those people, it basically lets them die or kills them, right? The migrant genocide is the mass of people that capital cannot provide for in the South comes to Europe, and instead of being killed prematurely by the social conditions of their country, of the periphery, they are killed by the dunes of the Sahara or the waves of the seas or Europe's neglect or, a Frontex drone, etc., etc. Essentially, it's two sides of the same coin, right? And where you have genocidal pressure against southern populations, that is carried out kind of, less visibly so because, in the north, we don't know much about the south, etc., etc. When it comes to European shores, we actually see it. And then this makes visible the infrastructure of, European imperialism in this case, or Western imperialism more general, right? Um, so yeah, the only thing that changes is that, there's white civil society saying, oh, this is a violation of human rights, right? But nothing about it is particularly brutal about the response of letting them die at sea, right? It's actually kind of the policy that is applied more generally across the South. And I think this brings us to your initial question, right? Which is, why is the migrant genocide a structural necessity for late imperialism? Well, it's a structural necessity because it has no other solution, right? Like on the one hand, imperialism is not going to let the South develop to avoid or to change the dire social conditions that lead to mass death there, mass premature death, right? It sanctions, it bombs any attempt at delinking, developing a policy that recirculates value within the formations, that protects indigenous industry, et cetera, et cetera. It just doesn't allow it. And on the other hand, it also won't take all the migrants that come from the South that is consciously underdeveloping with its policy, right? So it has no solution to it. The only solution it really has is, well, what is actually happening, right? You take capital by its acts, not by its words, right? And I think about your question about what shifts when we move away from more Eurocentric framings of it, I think for me there's value in trying to align analytical frameworks with people struggling in the South as well, right? Because I think this in and of itself gives our analysis more, I guess, strength, because there's a level of, if you will, coordination or alignment that I think was one of the things that made, the international back in the day such a force and such a thing to be feared by Western bourgeoisies, because, it's people both, just a few streets away from them and people on the other side of the world that are sharing a similar analysis and that are planning to do the same thing, that is overthrow you, right? And so I think there's a way in which that has political value in itself, and it's something that I think we should continue to do. to try to create analyses that, move us towards, synthesis and dialogue across realms, and not that, focus on, like over elaborated conceptual innovation or, things like these. So yeah.
Absolutely. And you suggest that by centering Europe's genocide at sea, we can forge a more coherent anti-imperialist position, one that resists the analytical traps of northern chauvinism, which you call the basis of the left's historical defeat. So can you elaborate on this a bit? How does this reframing help us foreground the peripheral national liberation struggles?
Right. Yeah. So I think it foregrounds these struggles because, um, intrinsic to the analysis of the migrant genocide is that it is particular nations that are being slaughtered, right? It is the Arab nation, it is the African nation, it is other nations in the south, and where they are from is exactly why they are being killed, right? So it's a national question, really, right? So by putting forth this analysis, you center this national question under imperialism, and there's a good example here of one of the leaders of an anti-imperialist and pan-African organization in Senegal called FRAP, France Dégage, which means France Get Out, which is, this movement that has been taken off across West Africa, kicking out the French and imperial troops and all of that. And his name is Guy Marius Sagna, and in many of the interviews and interventions that he makes in parliament, he was imprisoned as well, but he makes these connections, right? And something that he contests oftentimes is how police and military bodies in Senegal are being retooled to counter immigration to the north. In other words, at the service of Europe, they're being used to contain immigration at source, as the lingo has it. And so it is framed as, one of the leaders of this anti-imperialist, popular, and Pan-African front. It is framed in an analysis of national liberation, right? And I think it's kind of making the point, and this is my words, not exactly his, but, that national liberation entails that your people not being murdered at sea or in the desert or prosecuted by your police, by the police of Morocco or by the police of Spain, right, on their way north as they try to, again, find a way to make a living in different places, right? And so in a way, I think there's an important sort of element there as far as how the Southern national question is very linked and deeply connected to the migrant question in the core, right? And these are two very related elements. And so I think in that sense, the national liberation frame is very much centered. And I think, this analysis, in a way, what it does is helps us build a very solid anti-imperialist position because it is tied to the analysis of people in national liberation struggles and analyzing and struggling from the South, right? Of what is going on there on the ground, right? And so if we understand the migrant genocide, if we understand that the migrant genocide is the first moment of European class struggle, if we understand that European class struggle starts at the bottom of the sea, then you ward off, you protect yourself in a way from chauvinistic and reformist positions, right? Because chauvinism and reformism are very, very linked, right? The moment Northern working class, starts to conceive of itself as separate from the global movement of the working class, then you can start to see reforms within the context of your state as positive, right? Okay, so my national working class is getting some reforms, is getting some gains, so I'm pretty much good. Therefore, the chauvinism, insofar as you cleave off yourself from the rest of the world, can lead to a reformism, right? And by anchoring our analysis of class struggle in these particular phenomena, I think it's a way to counter that almost from the start. Obviously nothing is insulated from reformism, but yeah, I think it's a good move in a way. And then, I think there's some interesting points as well as far as like the connection between chauvinism and defeat, right? In the North specifically. And I think, this is something, and by chauvinism meaning, allegiance to your national or continental, if you will, working class, as opposed to internationalist solidarity, right? And I think Samir Amin argues this in many places, but I wanted to highlight a couple of other people that kind of pointed to this before Amin that I think are both very kind of revealing, right? The first one is Marx, right? And Marx, in a letter in 1870, a lot of folks will probably know this, but I think it's quite a nice thing to kind of just hear and have present. He talks about how the antagonism between Irish and English workers and I quote, is the secret to the impotence of the English working class despite its organization. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, right? He says, it is the special task of the Central Council of the International in London to make the English workers realize that for them, the national emancipation of Ireland is not a question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of their own social emancipation. Not mincing words there, right? Then we have also George Jackson's analysis of this, right? And in the chapter in Blood in My Eye, where he talks about the united left, he says the major obstacle to a united left in this country is white racism. It is the most critical barrier to our needs of unity, and it has served in the past to render the progressive movement almost totally impotent. Again, uses almost the same word as Marx. It's actually uncanny, right? But essentially, in different contexts, both of them are arguing how, beyond, moral sentiment, even strategically, national liberation is absolutely central to winning in both of these cases, right? So I think this is very important to think about more generally, right? And as far as kind of like the more recent history of this, I think, we have to think about kind of what social democracy is. And I think we'll get more into social democracy a bit later, but essentially, there's a point where in Europe, revolution wasn't the agenda, right? You had massive communist parties linked with the Soviet Union that, for all their faults, channeled mass desire for another type of society, right? And however, co-opted, there was a lot of Europeans who wanted socialism. And socialism of the type that was linked to the Soviet Union, even though, of course, there was dissidents and all of this, but that was there, right? And so, obviously, the European bourgeoisies were like, okay, this is not good, this is not great. And so they proposed a compromise, right? We'll give you social democracy, we'll give you a welfare state, and the relative security that brings, right? So, in a way, the welfare state is a form of deproletarianizing loads of people because life is a lot less uncertain. And we will do this only if you cut it with a revolutionary aspiration, right? Because remember, at that point, communist parties wanted world revolution. They didn't want reforms. They wanted the program was world revolution. And so, but the bargain here is, okay, we'll give you demands if you quit with that world revolution. In other words, if you abandon the South, if you compromise on the points that, concern the comrades that are far away, that are not close to you, and you can get some reforms and live better, right? Just don't interfere with our foreign policy, with what we do abroad, and you'll get what you want, right? And this was basically the bargain. Now, what happens later? The moment that they don't need the support of the white masses in Europe, they throw them under the bus. They throw us under the bus. In other words, they start doing everything that they had promised and partially given, right? All of social democracy, all of the welfare state, right? Essentially, after undoing the gains of the periphery, right? After, reversing a lot of the gains of the decolonization movement and independence and some of the attempts at development, and also with the targeting of the socialist movement globally, right? The decline of the Soviet Union, et cetera, capital no longer needs any support at home. So it starts the offensive at home, And I think, this is defeat. Because ultimately, the situation that, northern masses are in right now, which is a situation where, they can't even basically afford rent for the most part, is a direct result of having compromised on the imperialist question, on the international question. Because if they hadn't, they probably would have gotten a more emancipatory outcome than they ultimately did. And what we did get was something that was reversible and that was reversed whenever they could reverse it, right? So I think this is important to take into account, especially to counter social democratic arguments that are very ahistorical. So essentially, I think that's important to keep in mind as far as like the left defeat and chauvinism.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you answering both sides of those questions, by the way. But and there has been a endless sensationalistic coverage of the consequences of Donald Trump's migration policy. But you note that the ongoing slaughter of migrants, particularly in Europe, a structural feature of his social formation, remains largely unspoken. But you argue this silence isn't accidental, but a form of normalization, buried by forces across the political spectrum. So what does this erasure tell us about, Europe's ideological infrastructure?
Right. Yeah. So, well, I think, on a very basic level, it tells us that, its ideological infrastructure is racist through and through, right? Some lives are worth less than others. And so some make the news and some don't. Some mobilize and some don't. And it also tells us on another very basic level as well, that the ideological infrastructure of Europe is premised on loyalty to imperialism, and this is, it's easy to say, but I think when you analyze electoral sort of forces, parties in Europe, you realize that there's no electoral sort of option that has legal ambitions that can actually oppose, Europe's border policies. Because Europe's border policies are defined top-down from the European Union. They are not up for democratic debate in member states, except like some minor modifications which don't really change the nature of it, which is a system of two different sets of rights for the people that are citizens and the people that are migrants, especially the people that are illegalized or undocumented. So, you realize that, the ideological sort of range of the of Europe is very much kind of like circumscribed and limited by these things, right? But I think not only that, like it's not only that it's not, any type of option to actually counter these structures, but anybody who's actually doing any type of work with whatever type of discourse, like they don't have to be have any type of militant discourse that counters this structure, is criminalized. And so, I have comrades that have been working in the field in, search and rescue, with search and rescue boats in the Mediterranean or in the Atlantic and so on and so on. And, they've been called terrorists, they've been called international criminals, they've even been called slave traders and smugglers, like literally slave traders. And so I think, this very quick, immediate reflex criminalization of these people is indicative of the centrality of the question, right? And how also, what the ideological infrastructure, to your point, is in Europe, right? And I think one point that I think is important to also kind of think about here is, this is central to understanding social democracy in the world system, right? In the US, I found it so many times, right? Social democrats praising the European model, right? The Nordic model, or even telling me, oh, in Spain you have free healthcare, you have a lot more sort of welfare provisions and a better welfare state. You have a seemingly less racist police. It's all better over there. You even have beautiful buildings. Like it's better, right? And I would just answer to that the premise of all of that is the figures I started today with, right? Which is, that 12 people have been murdered every day in the first 5 months of this year, as they attempted to reach only Spain. Only Spain. That's one country out of 27 European Union member states. And so the seemingly milder, the seemingly more socialistic European model, the social democracy, is premised on all of this, right? It's premised in a similar way as the United States, as the North American or the settler colonial systems are, but it's arranged differently. And so it looks, I think it has better ways of, concealing these mechanisms than does, the settler colonial sort of formations. So anyway, yeah, I think the erasure of the migrant genocide, it's kind of a key way of fancying social democracy as a somewhat desirable outcome, right? As, yes, this is a way out, right? And I think we see this in the US and in other places quite a bit. So, yep.
Yeah, definitely. And you also point out that urban industrial production today can absorb the masses into employment, leading to explosive growth of slums and informal labor, which you noted of earlier. Samir Amin offers two reasons for this, right? First, that Europe's industrial model was labor intensive, and second, that modern industry, precisely due to technological advances in the last century, economizes the labor it employs. So can you walk us through this contradiction a bit?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this is related to what I said before. The first reason is that industry today needs a lot less workers than it did before, and it also needs workers that are extremely qualified, right? And so it doesn't need the type of person that is just being expelled of their land and has been a peasant, or is the son of peasants. It doesn't need those people, basically. And basically, this is the point of economizing the labor it employs. It uses less labor. I think the second contradiction, or the second change, is essentially, yeah, the lack of immigration outlets. The fact that you don't, like, the South doesn't have like settler colonies to export its people, and it can't genocide entire continents to make room for its populations that it took out of the land to have like a few capitalist farmers produce a lot of food. It doesn't have that. And so that's why there's really no way out of that. And I think, just to kind of like wrap this up, but like, I think in and of itself, this element is enough argument for Samir Amin's kind of overarching, if you ask somebody what Samir Amin's sort of general argument is that the South cannot catch up developmentally with the North, right? And, a lot of mainstream development economics and studies will say, no, well, you can't catch up if you do the right policies, right? And I mean, what he's saying here is, well, you have these two conditions that were the premise of the success of the European model. So what are you going to do with that, right? I think these are very, very strong arguments in favor of Amin's thesis of, that the South can't catch up developmentally by, mainstream capitalist neoliberal growth sort of policies. In addition to, obviously, the fact that a big part of the peripheries continues to be underdeveloped after, 70 years of developmentalism and development sort of gospel in the Northern academies. So I think that's very much proven enough. But yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And continuing on that point about Samir Amin, you build on his analysis to argue that the Southern agrarian question isn't awaiting some future genocide, but it's already happening or already being structurally enacted through mass premature death. We point to the brutal metrics of maternal mortality, malnutrition, illiteracy, and life expectancy as expressions of systemic genocide. So can you unpack this framing for us? How does it shift our understanding of primitive accumulation in the center periphery dynamic under really existing capitalism?
So yeah, I think, Samir Amin in 2003 has this, very clairvoyant or visionary sort of understanding that there's no solution to the Southern agrarian question, right? And then comes second or perhaps a third generation of third world political economists that bring this analysis to the fore and then extend it, right? People like Sam Moyo, like Parisieros, later in work with Praveen Jha, and finally Ali Kadri, which I think we're going to talk about in a bit. What they're saying is they're taking this conclusion by Amin and saying, well, the mass death is not actually, in store. It's not waiting. It's not coming in some apocalyptic future and we have to get ready for it. They're saying it's already happening now. The mass death is happening now, and it's happening through the metrics that you were mentioning, Josh. So, maternal mortality, child mortality, malnutrition, and above all, systematically lower life expectancies in the South, right? If we were in a world where capital wasn't dominant, everybody in the world could probably live until 95. And this is not the case because capital has other priorities, right? And works in different ways. And so these authors, what they really drive through is that like this is already happening and the solution is already being carried out. And we cannot think that this is in the future, but rather we have to understand it as a process that is unfolding as we speak.
Yeah, incredibly well stated. I appreciate that. And it gets me to our next point about, because I would love to talk about Ali Kadri's formulation of the accumulation of waste, which you touch on in this piece, in which he argues that monopoly finance capital hinges on the accumulation of waste, where wasted lives are not merely collateral, but central to the process of accumulation. He calls this a structural genocide of humans and surrounding nature, a mechanism that resolves the capital population contradiction by winnowing excess labor. So can you unpack this as well for us? How does this framework reorient our understanding of value surplus and the violence embedded in accumulation itself?
For sure. Yeah, this is a great question. And I will say to preface everything is, Ali Kadri's, like, I think groundbreaking conceptual sort of contributions are very complex and they're expansive. So it might be hard for me to do justice to them, but I'm going to try my best. Okay.
Yes.
And before jumping into that, like really fully, I wanted to touch just quickly on the last part of your last question, which is, how does this shift the understanding of primitive accumulation and the center-periphery dynamic, right? Because it's very related. So I'll get to Kadri in a second. I think what this generation of third world political economists do is, they incorporate into a political economy frame categories that before that were relatively alien to, classical and especially European Marxist frameworks, right? And so they incorporate things like, again, premature death, life expectancy, child mortality as parts that are to be considered in a political economy and analysis, not something that is outside, right? And in doing so, they incorporate that into our analysis of primitive accumulation. In other words, primitive accumulation is not just, I guess the more well-known and, legible in Marxist terms, forms like unequal exchange, wage stratification, the Argyris, the Sarcopes, etc. those things that are very centered on production and labor, but rather there are things that are not so legible with typical political economy or classical political economy terms, but that are still very relevant to political economy analysis, right? And here we can think of, frameworks like, Afro-pessimism, right? Afro-pessimism is a framework that kind of raises its theoretical edifice on distinguishing, the economistic labor process and the value formation of Marxist theory from death, right? Death as something that is particularly anti-Black, right? And so what these other thinkers are doing is saying, well, death and all of these other categories are not foreign to political economy. They're not foreign to value. They're not foreign to a political economy approach to totality, right? And so I think this is a very important point, right? And to get to Kadri now, right? I think Kadri's contribution is often framed as and understood as, centering imperialist war, militarism, and genocide as crucial to accumulation, right? Essentially, war and violence cannot be understood outside value formation, right? So this is not just to say, that war makes money, it's not just Nixon with the military industrial complex, but that it is to be that war is to be considered as part of value, the value process in Marx's very specific categories, right? So it's a very, it's a fine argument, and it's not simply like a disciplinary mechanism, right? It creates value. It's part of a value process, right? And this is very true, right? But I think in my reading of Kadri, there's a broader argument that is being made that goes beyond just war and militarism. Systemic destruction is kind of what he subtitles the accumulation of waste, right? And so I'm going to try to explain how I understand that. Because when Kadri talks about accumulation of waste, he often returns and mentions three things. He mentions wars, he mentions austerity, and he mentions pollution or ecological breakdown or destruction, right? In other words, he's not just talking about war, even though war and militarism are central to his analysis, but rather he's talking about several different processes that, on the face of it, seem hard to connect, specifically in his argument, but I think he's very much connecting in what is a very important point, right? And so how does kind of Kadri make his argument, or what kind of places can we hold ourselves to get through this argument? He talks about several times about, imperialism, the concept of imperialism that is constructed around the garment factory, right? Constructed about factories in Bangladesh or Vietnam, or super exploitation in these like special economic zones and industrial enclaves, no? In other words, in sites where production, in the very legible sort of Marxian framework, where surplus value is being produced, right? The global value chains, all of these things. And he tells us it is no longer sufficient to look at this and think that this is everything imperialism is, right? It is only a partial truth, right? And in a way, I think he's pointing us to what do we make of, the masses of people that are not engaged in these more legible forms of super exploitation, how do they contribute to value, right? And why is it that their contribution to value, in a way, once again, is relegated to a footnote in the global value relation, right? How is value drained there, right? What are the mechanisms? Because in a way, the focus on production does not necessarily allow us to fully grasp how, in places where there seems to be no connection to a global value chain, right, how that value is then exported to the core, right? Because I think you probably have found this as well. There's a lot of Marxism, including people like David Harvey, where first of all, they won't even mention the majority of the people of this world, but then also a lot of them, he will just say, oh, it's just a reserve army of labor, right? And so obviously this is limited, relegating big percentage of the population engaged in class struggle to just being a reserve army of labor is somewhat limited, right? And so how is the value drain performed here? I think here there's this brief work, excellent, by Isa Shivji. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but he's a Tanzanian development theorist and an economist, and he builds on the work of Moyo and Yeros, and it's called Accumulation in an African Periphery. And this piece is really very pedagogic and really succinct. So I really recommend everybody to go ahead and check it out. But to go to Kadri's point, I think part of his argument is that in these locations where it is less legible in classical Marxian terms, value is extracted through social reproduction and through the form that social reproduction takes in the South, which according to Kadri is de-reproduction, right? He often talks about, like, for example, with pieces with Mateo Capasso and so on, talks about imperialism as a system of social reproduction, right? And I should clarify here quickly that, social reproduction is not necessarily understood here in like the very kind of like ossified Marxist feminist, social reproduction is what happens in the home, right? And it's only domestic labor. No, social reproduction, I think, and at the risk of oversimplifying, is how a society organizes its survival, its reproduction, right? How capital, the peoples and the natures it subjects reproduce themselves, survive, etc., etc. And so I think the way I understand it, and I'm willing to be challenged on it for sure because it's a learning process, is a more holistic sort of understanding that includes production and that really is putting the lens on, or the focus on, how societies survive, how people survive, because it's no small matter in the world we're in, right? And so a quote by Kadri here, right, to kind of bring this point home is, and I quote, "It is not only the super-exploited garment worker who earns a measly wage, it is all of society which earns far less than it requires for a decent living," right? So it earns far less than it needs to survive, to socially reproduce, etc., right? So he kind of takes this holistic sort of approach and tells us, there are many ways in which the social reproduction of the global south, of the peripheral social formations, is being shortchanged or assaulted. And I think this is the conceptual core of his contribution as far as the accumulation of waste. The accumulation of waste is the forms that assault Southern social reproduction and make value out of it, right? And this is why, accumulation of waste refers to wars and militarism, but also to austerity and to pollution and ecological breakdown, right? These are processes that de-reproduce, in other words, that slow or fast kill the Southern masses systematically and structurally, right? And their premature death creates value. It's a product, it's an input, Kadri teaches us. And again, I think this is very important because I think it's something that political economy had not been fully able to theorize, to grasp within its own sort of language, right? And so if we think of it more specifically, right, like wars, what do wars do? They kill masses of people, and they literally interrupt their lives, their reproduction. Austerity, they banish the social support mechanisms for the reproduction of the people, right? They recommodify, the protective measures that some post-independent states had put in place, right? And in doing so, they de-reproduce society. And as far as ecology, right? It kills the natural bases that people need for their survival, for their social reproduction, and it makes them live less, and therefore it needs to spend less on their social reproduction because they're alive for a shorter amount of time, right? And so the value outlay on the social reproduction of the masses is less, and more value accrues to capital. In other words, you accumulate capital from this mechanism, right? And I think, war, the focus on war is important because, well, first of all, it's I guess the most salient sort of process when you look at it from the Arab-Iranian region, for sure. And it's the most extreme, Kadri often emphasizes, of assaulting that Southern social reproduction. It is paradigmatic, if you will, right? And that's why he tells us, every Coke can, right? Every run-of-the-mill commodity is in some way a bomb, right? The bomb is the paradigm, right? And I think another reason why he foregrounds that, the war and the militarism, is to counter, Western Marxism's sort of economism and the fact that it usually just leaves out war in particular out of value formation. So yeah, I think, to understand this in a more historical context, because this is kind of abstract, and I hope I'm making sense, by the way, but to make sense of this with more historical content, is that we get to the capital population contradiction that you mentioned, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think you find someone like Prabhat Patnaik that talks about, that above a certain threshold, the growth of a surplus population does not deflate the wage any further, does not contribute to lowering the wage, right? So they no longer contribute to, value via deflating wages of the people that are working, that are employed actually, right? And Kadri's contribution, as I understand it, is saying, well, okay, so these people that are no longer useful even for wage deflation for capital, how does capital use them? How does it reincorporate them into value formation? And I think Kadri's answer is by wasting them, right? It is here that the industry of waging the reserve army of labor emerges, right? In a context where the people outside the workforce in the global south has been mounting and growing quite amazingly in the past 30 years. This is something that is very well documented in Yaros's incredible piece on the sixth great power, right? So anyway, I think historically this is kind of where it lands, right? And this is why it's a contradiction, because capitalism can just not provide for all of the population it has across the world, right? And therefore it is a contradiction to its rule. And one of its solutions is, again, the accumulation of waste and ultimately depopulation, as Capasso and Kadri talk about, right? So systemic genocide is a way of managing surplus populations, which is interesting because there's a similarity there with Ruthie's analysis of the prison in relation to managing internal surplus populations. So yeah, I think that's kind of where it lands, the accumulation of waste and the capital population contradiction in this particular moment, and how the migrant genocide is an expression of that. So anyway, that was kind of abstract. I hope it kind of made sense.
With
But yeah.
Yes, great sense. And I appreciate you breaking it down. So you frame immigration not as a peripheral issue, but as a return to capital's principal contradiction, labor versus capital, but back to the core, where it disrupts the developmental and social peace arrangements that sustain imperial stability. In this light, you note that, and I'm quoting here, it's no surprise that immigration becomes the defining issue of contemporary core social formations, end quote. So can you unpack this contradiction and how it reasserts itself through migration and what it reveals about the fragility of the imperial center?
Yes, for sure. I think here Nkrumah is very helpful. And it's actually amazing how clear he writes and how insightful it is, despite it being tremendously accessible. He says, that neocolonialism is composed of, two main things. I'm simplifying, of course, there's a lot more, but two main things. One, which is the one that we usually think about, which is, the indirect control of independent nations via economics. And the second one is the one that I think is often overlooked, which is the welfare state in the North, right? And the welfare state in the North is a way in which the conflict, he says, and I quote, the conflict between rich and poor is transferred from the national to the international stage, right? And so I think these two things, these are the two legs of the neocolonial arrangement, right? And what this creates in the North is a particular neocolonial pact, if you will, or compromise, right? And this is an arrangement that, essentially shares some of the wealth with its working classes, provided that these working classes are cleaved off from the rest of the global working classes, which are not to get any of the share of imperialism and capital accumulation, right? And this arrangement is composed of, wages that kind of keep up with productivity, even though that's kind of fallen off. And again, the social safety net and all of these things, right? And then this in turn produces a arrangement of, social peace or political control, which is, you've pacified the population enough so that they're not insurgent like they might be in some other corners of the world, and therefore you can have a bourgeois democracy. Obviously, you keep some low-profile repression at the margins, et cetera, but you can kind of have it because people are not in an insurgent sort of situation. And this is, if you will, one of the secrets of how capital survived after World War II. This is what Nkrumah tells us, right? And Nkrumah tells us that there's a way in which this postpones the issues. It's not really, it exports them, but it doesn't solve them because they might come back, right? They might come home to roost, as Malcolm X would say. And so immigration, what it does is essentially bring these contradictions home to roost, right? Because in a way, it brings back, a contingent of people, in this case immigrants, right, that intensify or, if you will, stretch the scarcity that is artificially created by capitalists in the North, right? They're going to share only so much. But if you have more people, then you might have a problem. And secondly, it's a group of people that obviously are much less integrated into the cooptation mechanisms of the North. And so they produce certain situations that might not be as pacified in the national space, right? So in a way, it re-imports the contradiction that you had exported, and the class antagonism that you had exported with it comes back. And so this is a problem, right? And this is not to say that, that Northern capital is not interested in sourcing, super exploited migrant labor. It definitely is, but it just runs into this contradiction of, needing cheap labor, but also needing social peace or political control, which is a constant in capital's history, right? It's one of the main contradictions that kind of assail it every now and then. And so I think this is a way in which it is undone. And so, I think as far as it not being surprising, it's not surprising that it becomes the number one issue, even above, redistribution or, any type of social democratic measure. It is not surprising that it becomes so important because it kind of like targets the very kind of bedrock of the stability of the North, which was this neocolonial compromise, this division of the global working class, and the creation of one that is like racially guarded and economically sort of just co-opted basically, or satisfied, pacified. So yeah, I think it's when you bring this and you join it with the long-standing analysis among third world and national liberation movements that the imperialist contradiction is the principal one. I think it fits quite neatly that this is the reason why it's becoming such an important issue, right? Because you could ask the question, like, why, if Northern working classes are being impoverished en masse, right? Like, why isn't it redistribution that is the main issue, right? Like, why isn't that? No, it's immigration. Immigration is what wins elections, So I think this is a way to explain that.
Yes, absolutely. And you argue that European fascism is a reaction to the unraveling of the neocolonial arrangement that once stabilized the core. You suggest that social democracy, with this narrow focus on interior core redistribution, is fundamentally unfit to confront this moment. So can you speak to how the imperialist question, now expressed through third world immigration, exposes the limits of social democracy and the structural appeal of fascism in the core?
For sure. Yeah. I think this is a way to kind of bring what I was saying home about the neocolonial compromise, if you will. The neocolonial compromise, because of immigration, is in decline, right? The difference between fascism and social democracy is that fascism has a solution, or at least pretends to have a solution to this decline, and social democracy simply doesn't. Fascism's solution is to enforce draconian immigration enforcement measures to reinforce, the color line, cohere, if you will, the labor aristocratic bloc, and limit the access to jobs, to welfare, to benefits, to social and political rights to the people in that bloc, and exclude others, right? So it's to continue to deepen the division, the stratification of the class that was the bedrock of the neocolonial compromise, right? So it's saying, fascists are saying, we promise that we're going to salvage this thing that is the labor aristocracy, and, we will deliver on this. Okay. Social democracy, on the other hand, what it does is it equivocates, essentially. You find that it promises solidarity. It might even have some radical sounding slogans, right? It might work with immigrant organizations, grassroots, immigrant leaders, etc., etc. But when it comes to power, it does not prioritize it. It throws the people that supported it under the bus and basically does border enforcement as usual, right? Maybe keeping a bit on the low if it can, maybe not making too much of a fuss out of it because it's not, it's not great for its voters. They don't like that. But yeah, basically doing the same thing because, in the case of Europe specifically, as we said before, border policy is not something up for debate. There's no democracy in that. That's top down. And so they basically, unless they challenge that formation, they can't even do anything. But the point is, they throw people under the bus and they don't actually maintain their promises. They betray people from the third world when they actually come to power. And I say this, from an experience that, we have a social democratic government that now is also getting a very good press because of support for Palestine. And he's been, Pedro Sanchez, his name is, he's been in power for like 7 years now. And to kind of show you just the schizophrenia of this social democratic way, if you will, is on the one hand you have Pedro Sanchez propose and kind of entertain a proposal for mass regularization, that is giving papers to all the migrants in Spain, right? Which obviously comes from like mass mobilization in our movement before that. But on the other hand, you will find them co-signing the border massacre of June 2022 in the south of Spain, where like dozens of people were killed and disappeared, right? So you have those two poles, right? And social democracy essentially does not give a solution for the peoples of Europe. And I think the peoples of Europe realize that. And they're like, nah, this is bullshit. Fascism is actually, what is gonna sustain what we have lived off the past 70 years, which is the labor aristocracy. And so I think this is kind of why these left experiments, we'll have to see, right? But this is why these left experiments have declined into a relative irrelevance, especially the left flank of European social democracy. And yeah, like to put it in simple terms, right? Social democracy dances around that question that both Marx and George Jackson were saying is the secret to our impotence, right? It plays with it. It doesn't really care about it. It doesn't really prioritize it. And while it sometimes might have some benevolent measures and some overtures that look, in solidarity with migrants, it some other times will be murderous and completely aligned with imperial states. So I think that's a very important thing to take into account, why it cannot deliver any type of solution for Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I should be clear. And I don't know if you specify this, but you're talking about the Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez. It's just for everyone else, if the listeners who are not familiar with him. But yeah, so just wanted to add.
Sorry.
Well, our next question, you actually pretty much answered it, but I would like for you to kind of like elaborate on it a little bit more, because I think it's a global phenomenon, especially amongst the Euro Americas, where you see the emergence of these electoral left experiments, ultimately so, that are almost consistently across the board. Each of them have, in different ways, betrayed the interests and the demands of the colonized and the racialized, whether domestically in these nations or on the peripheral. Which is, generally speaking, you can bring up a case like that just about anywhere, especially this is the case in America, as many of our listeners already know, as you alluded to, but in Spain, same thing, right? So yeah, just so if just for a little bit, talk a little bit about these have failed mid 2010s left experiments and how they have helped pave the way for the far right to like steady march towards electoral and cultural dominance, right? And not just through their parties, but through the diffusion of their ideas into the so-called modern mainstream. With social democracy offering no real emancipatory horizon, you suggest that Europe's populations are retreating into the familiar, right? The neocolonial arrangements, that racially guarded labor aristocracy, and those who swear they'll maintain it, right? So, can you speak to how this dynamic is shaping contemporary European politics, as it is elsewhere, of course, and what it reveals about the ideological landscape sustaining the core?
Yeah, so I think, looking at it from the European context gives us added insight, because there's some left experiments, electoral experiments, that did get to government and did quote unquote succeed, right? One of them is Syriza in Greece, which basically folded whenever the European Union told them to fold on the debt question. And then another one is the case of Spain, right? And I just want to delve into the case of Spain because it's the one that I know the best, but also the one that stayed in power for the longest. Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister of Spain, has been in power for 7 years. And in the past 10 years, so most of his mandate, rental prices have gone up by 95%. Just like that, right? And so there you have a government that supposedly is going to deliver for European working classes, right? And is going to deliver some sort of transformative reforms in in a context where, before you had like very tepid, like neoliberal lefts and, their type projects. And what we have is like real impoverishment of the majority of people, right? And I think this is exactly what leads to paving the way for fascism, because there's a certain impotence to the project that, because it's not actually willing to challenge the powers that be, despite its rhetoric, because it ultimately has loyalty to the bourgeois state, the imperial state in Europe, it actually does not deliver on anything. And I think in other contexts, Bernie, Corbyn in its first iteration, even La France Insoumise in France, they didn't get to power, but they failed to deliver a win, right? And I think that's also important. Like, what is the strategic sort of reflection that hasn't led to you even having a go at changing things, right? So I think that's something that people have in mind, and people, kind of like, just basically are not convinced by. So yeah, I think in Europe you find that, just as you find it in North America, the rise of the far right is, very important in 2024. Also in European elections, it just rose quite a bit. And then the latest iteration of this is, the fool in chief, Keir Starmer, saying, I will take back control of our borders, and basically tightening the gap between European fascism and European social democracy, which, might be the coming sort of trend in the wake of realizing how actual social democracy is quite powerless to really solve anything. So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's a good place to end off of. But before I let you go, I'll let to give you the opportunity to tell folks where they can find you and to shout out any projects you're working on. And yeah, just let me know.
For sure. Yeah. So I think, to follow me, you can just follow me on Twitter. It's Iker Suarez and then Z. I always have trouble pronouncing that letter, but you get me, I think. Um, and then I think right now I'm working on a couple more pieces, kind of developing some of the thoughts that we had here. One is coming out soon. Is going to be like a simple, more accessible one that kind of like develops the arguments of the piece we discussed today. And then I'm working on some other pieces on, more the labor aristocracy, and so on and so forth, to kind of try to develop this a bit more. So yeah, and nothing else really. I think, I really want to just shout you guys out. Your work has been amazing. I've been learning from y'all for years, and so it's really an honor to be here and engage with y'all. And yeah, just very appreciative of what y'all have been doing in basically educating us for many years.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been an honor. First of all, I really love this piece. And love this so much. I've read from you, and we're going to definitely have you back on here very, very soon, if possible. But yeah, so thank you again. Dude, this was great. And I think people are really going to find it illuminating, especially because I'm pretty sure that some of the fans of the pod are going to be doing a reading group for accumulation of waste,
Yeah.
like preface for it. So yeah, I'm excited for it.
Yeah, that's amazing. Really cool.
Awesome. Thank you again for coming on.
All right. Thank you, Josh. Peace.
Bye.